Today, I'm going to talk about how to deal with a narcissistic parent. It is my belief that narcissistic parents are actually quite common, even though generally society and a lot of us, we don't really understand narcissistic traits. A lot of us have grown up with parents where we just got a feeling, we just kind of knew that something was off, but we didn't really understand what was going on or why that we felt that way. So, my hope today is, of course, never to shame or blame any parents, but to share information that'll hopefully help a lot of you understand your parent and their behavior. Also, to understand how it impacted you. And of course, what you can do now to begin to heal. The greatest impact of being raised by a narcissistic parent really comes down to how you behave in your own relationships. Ultimately, when we were raised by narcissistic parents, we are primed to believe that we have to work to earn people's connection, to earn their love. And what comes along with that work is we have this idea that we have to accept difficult people and their difficult behaviors, even when they don't seem to care or they don't seem to want to change. So here are some quick signs now that you yourself might have been raised by a narcissistic parent. One sign is you might notice that you constantly feel guilty, or you always feel like you're in trouble. The second sign, you might notice that you spend a lot of your time in your adult relationships making excuses for other people's bad behavior. Another sign similar to this is you might notice that within your relationships, you're always enabling other people's issues, or that you have a history of codependency. It's showing up in care of someone else, trying to manage someone else, ultimately finding yourself in trauma bonds or simply in relationships with dysfunctional dynamics. A fourth sign that you might have been raised by a narcissistic parent is you might notice that you feel anxious or depressed. You might even remember feeling anxious and depressed from childhood for as long as you can remember. I have some more content on narcissistic parents that I'll make sure to link in the description that you can check out. Because now I'm going to share some helpful reminders for all of you raised by narcissistic parents as you get started healing. For many of you, this is going to be life-changing because it'll probably be the first time, maybe ever, that you're putting yourself and your own needs above the needs of your parent. So let's get into some ways, some reminders that are going to be helpful for you along your journey. The first powerful reminder is that your parent is still developmentally immature. Growing up, a lot of us idealize our parents, right? We see them as these superheroes, people that can do no wrong. We don't actually see them as human beings because in childhood, they are quite literally the center of our world. We're completely dependent on them and we spend most of our time with them. Now that we're adults, we can begin our own healing process by beginning to see our parents in a more grounded and in a more realistic light. And the reality is, when a parent is narcissistic, they haven't themselves fully gone through all of their own developmental phases. So they're still emotionally immature or regressed from an earlier emotional time. And you might see this in your parent when they become reactive. They start screaming, yelling, stomping off, or maybe they make every single situation, every conversation about themselves. Sometimes, and with practice, we can even begin to see the child in them in these moments because a lot of times their behavior really does mirror how children behave. One of the best exercises that we can do is to begin to not only realize, maybe even sometimes visualize in those moments where there's a lot of dysregulated behavior, the small child stuck inside our parent's adult body. Now, a lot of times, a lot of us might notice we want to have these deep conversations. We want to bring up things from the past. We want to try to change our dynamic with our parents. But the reality for most of us is that our parent is simply not emotionally mature enough to be capable of meeting us on this journey because their emotional age doesn't actually match up with their chronological age. Now, of course, this isn't a cop out or it's not an excuse, but this understanding really can help us because a lot of us try exhaustingly to change our parents. We try to get them to understand us, we try to get them to meet our needs. And what we're trying to do a lot of the times is we're trying to do this with people who are simply not capable or not willing. So reminding ourselves that our parent is really developmentally immature will go a long way. Second, really powerful, helpful reminder is your parent is not the authority of the truth. You are. When we grow up with narcissistic parents, we are constantly exposed to gaslighting or simply having our reality denied over and over again, being told that didn't happen, it's not as bad as we think, being outright lied to, right? Maybe we're told it's not a big deal. Maybe we're told we're too sensitive. Maybe things are swept under the rug, or our parents pretend that big things, small things, things in general didn't happen. Regardless of the type of gaslighting, when our reality is denied growing up, we end up having a really hard time trusting ourselves. We have this overwhelming sense of self-doubt. Though here's the thing, your parent never was, never is, and never will be an authority on the truth. They are not the authority on what did or what didn't happen. Your parent, of course, they can have their own perspective on a situation, and at the same time, you can have a completely different perspective. Your truth might be very different from their truth. And regardless of how different it is and how difficult your reality might be, your reality and your truth is always valid. One of the most common coping mechanisms for narcissistic parents is denial. Denial is how so many of us even cope with our shame. We deny it. We deny the things that we feel badly about. So remember, you yourself are the final authority on whatever it is that you experience or what you didn't experience and how you feel about it. Even if your parent or your other loved ones disagree, or even if they refuse to acknowledge it. A third helpful, powerful reminder on your journey is you are not responsible for the outcomes of your parents' life. Narcissistic parents teach us from a young age that we are responsible for their emotional states and ultimately for other people's emotional states. And this is why so many of us grow up feeling like for as long as we can remember as a childhood, we were a parent ourselves, or we were our parents' best friend or their therapist, always responsible for their emotional well-being. And this then created adult children who continue to feel overly responsible for their parents' life. We end up feeling like we have to be the one to rescue our parents, to make their life better, even when they refuse to change any of their habits, patterns, or their behavior on their own. It is common for narcissistic parents to have dysfunctional relationships, to have dysfunctional coping patterns, such as using substances. A lot of times these parents expect us, even as adults, to always be on call for their latest crisis, to hear about their issues, or for them to vent, all of the while they are not actually being there emotionally for us or for their other children. Now, as difficult as this is, it is so extremely important to begin to set and to have clear boundaries. Now, boundaries are not to control your narcissistic parents' behaviors because we can't really control their behaviors or anyone else's. But boundaries we can set around how we are going to interact within the relationship with our parents. Maybe we set boundaries around how available we'll be to answer their text, to answer their calls, or generally how and when we'll be available to engage with them at all. Now, of course, as you first begin to set new boundaries, especially if you don't have them yet, a lot of you will probably end up feeling guilty and feeling selfish. But the more you practice, the more confident and empowered you'll feel, and the more space you'll have for yourself, even if your parent continues not to change or take responsibility at all. A fourth helpful reminder on your journey is, regardless of how old you are right now listening to this, you can reparent yourself. As I talked about earlier, a lot of people with narcissistic parents have spent their entire life focused on their parent or focused on everyone else around them and not focused on themselves. Some of you might even remember feeling a lot of pity or a lot of sympathy for your parents. And you probably don't remember too many times where your parents were there for you emotionally, interested in, caring about, asking about your internal world, your emotions, your interest, wondering how you felt, comforting you when you're upset. It is actually really common to not be able to comfort ourselves, to understand our emotions, and ultimately to not know who we are, because we weren't raised in an environment where we had the chance to develop a sense of self, to understand and be curious about ourselves, because no one modeled that for us. And this is why it is so incredibly important to begin to reparent yourself. Reparenting is really simply becoming the parent that you have never had. It can be the smallest of acts, like learning how to be patient with yourself, speaking to yourself more kindly, or maybe making sure that you eat a nutritious meal, or maybe giving yourself just a few moments to sit down, to rest, to relax, to breathe. Begin to notice now even, how do you speak to yourself throughout the day? And begin to practice talking to yourself like a patient adult would talk to a child. You want to be the person that's comforting yourself, that's rooting you on, that's encouraging you to follow your own dreams, and that's reminding you that you are safe and valued, regardless of what anyone around you is saying or doing. And the final helpful reminder on your journey is, you can grieve, and you need to grieve, the parent that you never got. The difficult truth is that a lot of our parents are not willing or not able to self-reflect, the first step that for a lot of us leads to changing. And so many of us want them just to get it, just to understand how their behavior is impacting us, and to begin to show up differently in a more maybe supportive way within the relationship. And the reality is that for some of us, that may never happen. And while this is one of the most painful experiences that we can have in life, we have to realize that we did not get and might not have the loving, nurturing, and supportive adult that we deserved. We didn't get an adult who was able to put their stuff aside and to show up for us. And within that reality, we have to give ourselves time and space to grieve that loss. Grief can look like so many things. Some of us might feel angry some days, and other moments or days we feel sad and we feel guilty. A lot of the times we'll continue to wish that we could just help them, get them to see things or do things differently. There will be so many different emotions that come up along this journey. And for a lot of you, writing them out, journaling about them, maybe even writing a letter to your inner child or talking to a trusted loved one, sharing this reality will allow us to feel all of the different ways that we might feel about the circumstances that we were raised in, of the needs that we didn't get met, of maybe the abuse and the violation that we did experience. And ultimately, grieving is how we process and how we can begin to move forward with our lives. When we grieve, we're no longer stuck in that past. We're actually able to let it go so we can open ourselves up for a new future. I hope this was helpful for everyone out there who is dealing with a narcissistic parent. And I want to remind each and every one of you, you are always good enough. You are capable of all things, regardless of how you have been made to feel. And as always, I'd love to hear about you and your experiences with your own narcissistic parents. Leave it in the comments below.